As the 80s rolled into its midway point of 1985, there were two things that had run rampant: sequels and slashers. The slashers are nearly too many to name: Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Michael Myers, who all saw their first action, or would get the bulk of their sequels in the decade of the slasher. While most of these stuck to a very similar formula to continue to churn out profit as much as gore, there were a select few that deviated. Day of the Dead is kind of a sequel in name only, with the movie following the aftermath of the human race, but not any of the characters. It's less misunderstood and more ahead of its time. Elsewhere, we would be treated, and I use the term loosely, to both The Hills Have Eyes 2 and Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf. These aren't misunderstood by any stretch either. They're just not good. So we will look at two truly misunderstood horror sequels in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, and Friday the 13th, A New Beginning.
Back in the 80s, they were fun. I mean, you would laugh and they were a good time. And I think that that's something that I really recall about those movies then, is that even when people were dying horrible deaths, they were fun and you would laugh.
The sequel phenomenon isn't exclusive to the 80s. We would have sequels like Exorcist 2, The Heretic, or Jaws 2 try to capitalize on the hype and success of their series' first films, only to be met with the law of diminishing returns. The 80s is where studios and the creators of these films really figured out how to churn them out regularly and make a profit enough to keep the cycle going. Friday the 13th would get its start in 1980, and by 1985 we would be on our fifth go-around with everyone's favorite hockey mask-wearing killer. While A Nightmare on Elm Street had its first entry come out in 1984, New Line Cinema realized the potential of not only the movie, but a startling new horror villain. First was Friday the 13th: A New Beginning, which would come out on March 22, 1985. It would make nearly $22 million on its $2 million budget, but that is also a steep decline from Part 4. So plans for a new 3-film series with its own villain and story arc were cancelled. The reason for this was the poor reception to what ended up being the movie's twist. See, it's not actually Jason doing the killing. The main character is Tommy Jarvis, played by Corey Feldman in the previous movie, and very briefly in a flashback here, who is off to a halfway house after multiple stints in institutions to try and heal him of his trauma. A series of unfortunate events leads to the death of an inmate, and Jason, or someone who sure looks like him, starts killing the other patients and anyone in the surrounding area. When it's all said and done, we find out that who we thought was Jason was actually Roy Burns, the father of the patient who was brutally murdered in the first part of the movie. To keep this under wraps, the film's creators didn't make it known that this was a Friday the 13th movie to the cast initially. By the time I was old enough to start watching these movies, it was via a VHS marathon courtesy of Video Unlimited down the street. I would rent 2 of them at a time and watch them a few times each to really soak in the kills and the nudity that everyone wanted to watch these for. Having the benefit of older brothers and hearing about the series as a whole, I was already aware that the killer in the 5th installment wasn't in fact Jason. I didn't know the whole story, and quite frankly, I didn't care. This movie had everything that I wanted after having mainlined the first 4 over a 2-week period. In fact, it originally had a whole lot more, but the MPAA demanded that the movie be heavily edited down to get an R rating. This also caused strife between producer Frank Mancuso Jr. and writer-director Danny Steinman, who fought over a lot of the production, with Mancuso calling Steinman a pervert and accusing him of making a porno rather than a slasher movie. Paramount gave Steinman a 2-picture deal, but a sequel to The Last House on the Left fell through, and this ended up being the last movie he ever directed. While the movie was not the failure that its reputation would suggest, the critical reception and fan reception of Roy Burns as the killer was abysmal. Only a handful of principal cast knew what the twist was, but everyone hated it when they were working on it and knew that it wouldn't work. They ended up filming a few scenes to explain further who Roy was, because they didn't expect anyone in the audience to piece together that he was the paramedic from the first scene. Roy would later get some love from fans, and even end up in the Gun Media-produced asymmetrical horror game, Friday the 13th: The Game, as a playable version of Jason. It's still divisive today, but when you boil it down to its parts, it's still very much a Friday the 13th movie. A score by Harry Manfredini, people being killed in the woods by a hockey mask-wearing killer, and to that point, the most gore and nudity in the series. Had the gamble of not using Jason paid off, we could have had a whole different set of movies following this one with the Tommy Jarvis character as the new series villain. Oh, what could have been. Friday the 13th wasn't the only franchise with a sequel that played with expectations. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge was almost a very different movie on top of being, well, a very different movie from the prior year's first movie. Robert Shea of New Line Cinema needed a hit, but also needed to cut costs down a bit. Originally, this led to Robert Englund being turned down for a pay raise, and an unnamed extra being put in a mask was then going to play Freddy. Can you imagine anyone else playing the character during the series' heyday? We would at least get a TV show and 8 movies with Englund in the role before the remake would try something new with Oscar nominee Jackie Earle Haley as the Byrne Dream Killer, while Halloween would wait 2 movies to try something different with its now classic Season of the Witch, and Friday the 13th would try something new in Part 5. The Elm Street series would begin to tweak the formula after only the first movie. Jack Sholder was brought in after he wrote and directed Alone in the Dark, which New Line also made. Originally, he didn't want to do horror, but looked at the landscape and realized it had the potential to put him on the map. This is another one that, when I first watched it, I more or less just saw it as another slasher movie, because I watched it immediately after the first one, and I felt that it was a lesser version of that. All the subtext and changes that were put in only dawned on me much later. I did remember feeling that Freddy was much more menacing looking in this movie, and that's thanks to Kevin Yeager.
Well, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is a strange one, and I don't like the film. I'll say it, and I think that again it was over the top, and it was such a departure from the first one from a tone standpoint. When Halloween 3 came about, it was so vastly different that you accepted the tonal shift. You accepted the fact that Michael Myers wasn't in it. This felt like a tonal shift, but it had the same ideas. It still was kids falling asleep. It was still Robert Englund. It still had that thing.
But the movie was again a success, making just shy of $30 million on its $3 million budget. It's also known as the only film in the franchise with a final boy rather than the traditional slasher final girl. In fact, when you look at horror in general, it's incredibly rare for movies to go against that trope. The movie character here is Jesse, and he and his family have moved into Nancy Thompson's house on Elm Street. The movie ties the story back to the original in a couple of ways, predominantly by having Nancy's journals found and her nightmares similar to those that Jesse's having, Freddy included. Instead of just Freddy taking out the children of Elm Street, he's trying to possess Jesse and make him kill for him before entering the real world to cause more havoc. Freddy's Revenge feels a lot darker when watching. While Freddy wasn't in his silly phase yet in this one or the first one, he at least toyed with the main characters in a somewhat comical way, even if it was a disturbing kind of black comedy. There is nothing like that, or the outright comedy attempted in later films here. His makeup, especially his eyes and demeanor, are played strictly for terror. That being said, looking at it through adult and more seasoned eyes, you see exactly what made the movie kind of contentious at the time, and even slightly divisive now. Whether you call it subtext or in your face, the movie focuses on homosexuality and some of the unique trials and tribulations that the LGBT+ community has gone through. While some of the cast and creators claimed not knowing anything about it for a long time, one of the actors who immediately saw it and embraced it was Robert Englund, who embraced the fear that it would elicit in certain audience members.
one of the subgenres is gay horror, and I think that maybe I didn't understand it at the time when I first saw it. I think that's it, and so now I respect it as something that is a culty-like film. I think when I first saw it, I was not expecting it to be as vastly different from the first one as it was. And so for me, it'd be an interesting one to rewatch now. It's a weird one for sure.
It took a lot of time and a lot of open discussions from star Mark Patton, who at the time of filming was not openly gay yet. But eventually, the screenwriter discussed using a lot of the ongoing homophobia to craft the script. Patton also went back and forth on his interpretation of the script versus following every word and action that he was given. It is Robert Englund's least favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but not for anything discussed so far. He agrees with Wes Craven that the character strays too far from the rules set up in the first movie. It is striking to watch, particularly when you first discover this wonderful series of movies, just how different the feeling is for this one compared to the first. While it does go in a much darker direction for the character of Freddy, it is also largely like something out of a different slasher series based on how many new and different things Krueger can do. At the midpoint of the decade, horror was still trying to find something different with its movies. We were treated to all of the major categories and then some. Sequels and certain trends, particularly slashers, had to make the movie stand out while keeping the elements that brought in bucks. We all had favorites too. You would go to the theater or rental store multiple times to see the one that you considered your favorite, or at least really rewatchable. But if it didn't resonate with you, then it could be a one and done. If the movie didn't bring anything new to the table, it ran the risk of being too generic or been there, done that. On the other side of the coin, if it strayed too far from the tried and true formula, it could alienate its existing audience and kill a whole series or idea. Friday the 13th: A New Beginning has been one of my favorites since I first saw it. It delivers everything I'm looking for in that particular franchise, while also having a sleaze to it that's almost endearing. I applaud it for trying something different, particularly after the previous movie was subtitled The Final Chapter. While it still has low rankings and elicits anger from parts of the horror community, it has come a long way in its public opinion. Not quite as far as Freddy's Revenge though. Not only has that movie become a big cultural piece for horror in the gay community, and given star Mark Patton almost icon status as the self-titled first final boy, but it regularly shows up in people's lists of their favorite Freddy outings. While 1985 has some movies that were big at release and still maintain that status today, like Fright Night, The Return of the Living Dead, and Re-Animator, it also had its fair share of sequels that came out and tried new things. While some of those, like the previously mentioned Howling sequel and the Hills Have Eyes follow-up, still don't have their big argument to attain that classic status, today's double dose of slashing was simply misunderstood. They offered that great mix of the same but different that had people being conflicted when they first saw them, but enough intrigue to keep bringing us back to discuss and dissect. The debate will rage on as the next generations go back and watch these and their respective series as a whole. Sometimes it just takes time. And like our featured killers, the ability to never stop trying.
There's something different about you.
Michael J. Fox is a wolf in teens clothing. Teen Wolf, rated PG, now playing at a theater near you.
When Teen Wolf was released, we had the fortune of having 2 movie theaters just a short drive away from our family house. During the school summer breaks, my parents were busy working, so from time to time, my grandmother would take me to the nearest cinema to see whatever the early screening would be. Or if it were a weekend, I'd be whisked off to a Saturday matinee, pockets full of sweets from the nearest convenience store, as Grandma would always bemoan just how expensive the concessions were back then.
What a fucking liberty!
And this was the 80s we're talking about, so times must have been hard, even then. We'd see movies such as the Tom Cruise adventure Legend, The Goonies, and of course Back to the Future. However, she drew the line at sneaking us in to see Friday the 13th: A New Beginning. Come on, Gran. I thought you were cooler than that. The experience of going to the cinema back then was different from how it is now. There was an interval where ushers would sell ice cream down the aisles. And of course, no idiots were texting or Snapchatting during the performance. Happy times. Before we could see Teen Wolf, Michael J. Fox's other, more significant franchise, Back to the Future, had already been in theaters for 7 weeks. allowing his Wolfout comedy to ride the coattails of the time travel juggernaut perfectly. Looking back on Teen Wolf for this episode, it's clearly a movie that exists to entertain and leave you with a big ol' hairy grin on your face afterward, and it more or less manages to do so.
She's right. You are an animal.
Let's also not forget that the family-friendly horror comedy genre can be massively hit or miss. Just look at the fun but admittedly subpar entries such as My Mom's a Werewolf, My Best Friend is a Vampire, Wicked Stepmother. However, the 80s did bring us some pretty decent horror movies that were mostly suitable for young, impressionable horror fiends like me. Gremlins, of course, stands proudly at the top of the kid-friendly horror list, but titles like The Monster Squad, Killer Clowns from Outer Space, and the Critters series also provided awesome entertainment value. Well, thinking about it, there were certain scenes in Critters that my folks probably would have objected to me seeing if they knew what dodgy VHS tapes I had acquired for the weekend. However, Gremlins and Critters aside, Teen Wolf was one of the movies from the 80s that really connected with me, not only for kicks but as a burgeoning adolescent learning about life. Its themes of youth, self-discovery, puberty, and being one of the outsiders in high school really connected with me. And while the movie concept wasn't anything particularly new, it struck a chord with me big time. In fact, you could actually argue that Teen Wolf took a few creative liberties from Larry Cohen's 1981 comedy, Full Moon High, in which a high school football player becomes a werewolf after a trip to Romania, and he struggles to come to terms with his new reality. Sound familiar? Just swap Romania for Hereditary Wolfouts, and that's the plot of Teen Wolf right there. What that rather average movie didn't have going for it, however, was a star with massive worldwide appeal. You see, long before any of the more recent big or small screen werewolves leaped onto our screens, there was another hairy young lupine, Scott Howard, who broke our hearts and slam-dunked baskets for fun. And as we all know, Michael J. Fox was already a household name thanks to his role in Family Ties. But it was really the back-to-back release of Back to the Future and Teen Wolf that really shot him to fame. While the movie has many elements that make it such an entertaining horror spin-off, it's really Fox's performance in the title role that sells the movie. While Michael J. Fox lent his rising star power to the movie, it's fair to say that a lot of the cult appeal of the movie has been basically down to being a formulaic coming-of-age high school movie that doesn't allow its admittedly ridiculous plot twist from getting in the way of its tried and trusted non-horror premise. Overall, Teen Wolf probably had more in common with teen comedies from the era than the likes of An American Werewolf in London. But that made it way more accessible for its target demographic than if producers had gone for violence over shits and giggles. The movie's development was co-written by Jeff Loeb, who has since produced TV shows like Lost, Smallville, and Heroes, and as an executive vice president of Marvel Television. So you can clearly see a pattern in his subsequent work, with the aforementioned productions sticking to a similar central premise. The story of Teen Wolf follows Fox's teenage character, Scott, who lives with his furry-faced dad in an idyllic American suburb, with all of the stereotypical traits that come with the setting. He's got the picket fences, the best friend who thinks he's cool as fuck, the female best friend who is cool as fuck. Just Scott doesn't realize it yet. Plus, all of the social anxieties that go hand in hand with being a teenager. We can probably all relate to this, apart from the life-altering lupine abilities, that is. I'm pretty sure that's not a thing, right? Scott is part of the high school basketball team and is smitten with the untouchable hot blonde cheerleader type who'd rather date dudes with eyebrows almost as hairy as our werewolf protagonist than hang out with Scott. After a night out at a party, in which he gets a little too rough while making out with his best friend Boof in a closet, he returns home and promptly undergoes a rather strange transformation. This goes far beyond simple growing pains as Scott experiences his first transformation as a werewolf.
Speaking of laughter and comedies, Teen Wolf was a delightful watch for me. I was a big fan of Michael J. Fox, as we all were and are, and something about his brand of comedy and his reactionary comedy works so well for me. So here he was, this teenage kid, with things happening to him that we could all relate to, sort of, because that's an era of puberty has hit all of us. We go through changes. It's like, what's happening to me? I feel different. I look different. I smell different, right? And then, but add to that, turn up the volume on that a bit. And you've got Michael J. Fox going through his transformation into a werewolf and not wondering what the heck happened. One of the visuals I can't get out of my head is when he was changing in a locker room and he noticed this long couple of hairs coming out of his chest that were like this long. He's like, oh, ha ha, and how much that hurt. So it was a throwback that we can all relate to, like things are happening, things are growing, but that was quite fantastical and boding of things to come for him.
Although the werewolf is one of the most classic monsters in all of horror, it historically didn't have quite the same appeal as similar characters such as Dracula and Frankenstein. Plus, it didn't have the same literary background to mine from. However, their origins go much further back than some of the other classic Universal monsters, to European folklore's rich and strange narratives. Legend has it that these fearsome creatures are humans who turn into savage wolves each time there is a full moon, either by way of curse, a bite, or even by choice. This transformative act has proven to be rich in symbolic resonance. It can suggest the return of the modern human to the more primitive animalistic form, and the physical manifestation of the primal beast hidden within us all. In Teen Wolf, Scott's transformation doesn't find himself roaming the countryside feeding on the weak, nor does he seek human flesh in his own suburban setting. On the contrary, his transformation sees him becoming a hairy, much shorter Michael Jordan, who gets the hot blonde cheerleader type while using his teeth to open beer cans, without much violence seen in between. It's in Scott's transformation scene, and all of the hints that his Wolfout is imminent, that we really get to the core of the movie's leanings towards the horror genre. Relatively near the movie's beginning, Scott begins to sprout long hairs and scores a keg of beer from a reluctant storekeeper with his red wolf eyes and intimidating growl. After seeing this scene, I remember thinking how cool it would be to nip over to my local convenience store on my skateboard and coerce the shopkeeper into selling me beer by the way of scary eyes and a gravelly voice. I never tried, mainly because Big Bro was pretty good at acquiring booze back then without the need for wolf intimidation to help him out. Thanks, bro.
Did you or did you not distribute alcohol and marijuana to minors?
No, Your Honor, I did not.
Told you this defendant wasn't cool.
Well, no, hold on a minute.
The transformation scene itself lingered long in my memory, and looking back on it for this retrospective, it still has that cool 80s charm about it. The VFX is pretty neat for the era, and although Michael J. Fox's face looks a tad rubbery as he's contorting into his werewolf form, it's still a fun, if humorous sequence. His overall werewolf form isn't the most realistic look, but that's not really worth being critical of in a film of this nature. The Wolfout concept is absurd in itself, so the fact that Fox's wolf form looks a tad silly isn't really an issue. While Teen Wolf definitely struck a chord with me for its aforementioned themes, it has many more attributes that take me right back to being a young aspirational gorehound each time I manage to catch this movie again. Daniel's other most prominent movies I was aware of in the 80s were the likes of K9 from 1989, so it wasn't his influence as a director that guided and influenced me. Rather, I remember the movie's overall cast and notable sequences with such fondness after all these years. I thought Scott's best friend, Styles, was hilarious, with humor well matched by the quote-laden t-shirts that he wore and funny merchandise he peddles for Scott post-Wolfout. His other best friend and ultimate love interest, Boof, also caught my attention, probably more than the traditionally hot blonde cheerleader did. And despite knowing that they would end up together, their relationship is partly what makes this movie work so well. In terms of supporting characters, we also get Scott's Ewok-like dad, whose appearance makes me laugh just as much now as it did back in the day. He gets a great scene late in the movie where he confronts his former tormentor, Vice Principal Thorne, making Rusty piss himself in the process. There are also many other characters that linger long in the memory. Jay Tarse's coach Finstock, as well as Scott's basketball team with Mark Holton's Chubby, a standout. However, while these characters are all well written and memorable, and add their own qualities to the story, they fit in with the requisite template of such a movie. This isn't a criticism, far from it, as although the movie has its flaws, it still has enough sequences that render it a classic in the eyes of this movie fan. The basketball scenes may be a tad drawn out and unspectacular, but they're fun, and you still have that euphoric moment when non-Wolf Scott helps his team win the championship game against all odds. Is it predictable? Of course, but that's not the point. It's the perfect ending for a movie that revels in showing a teen werewolf surfing his own Wolfmobile, tearing around the basketball like a badass, and ultimately turning down the hot cheerleader for his true best friend, and most likely future spouse. The movie spoke to me on many levels as a young person, and although it's flawed, that doesn't stop it from being such an important part of my movie-watching adolescence. If you haven't seen the movie, comb back that awesome mullet, whack on your favorite Dayglow tank top, and rock out with your fangs out while sinking your wolf teeth into a beer or two. However, if you've seen the movie, then what's your take on it? Does it stack up as a horror comedy? Should it be kept in that kid-friendly family comedy genre? And does it hold up as a classic movie in its own right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.
These waves are mine.
Classic tale of horror. Re-Animator. Remember, you've been warned.
He's dead? Not anymore.
Re-Animator. Who doesn't love Herbert West? The Re-Animator was one of those movies that everybody talked about. And if you really look at Re-Animator, the thing that everybody remembers is that visual gag of getting or receiving head.
For those unsuspecting viewers who saw this without warning or any expectation, Re-Animator is either pure delight or an absolute aberration. Of course, it seems like the film was made to be a bit of both in the best way possible. It was Stuart Gordon's second directorial effort and his third writing credit. The man is now known for his genius and weirdness, but also his sweetness. He was the kind of man when meeting him at a convention or festival, it was not just an honor, it was a delight. He had stories forever and was a charming man who enjoyed spending time with fans. Having passed away in 2020, he is deeply missed in the community, and for good reasons. His work was solid until the very last, and Re-Animator showed fans how talented and weird he was. I had seen bits and pieces on television, but it took a few years and many trips to the video store to be curious about it. You see, the VHS box art for the film enticed me. It has a man with a glowing syringe. It was pretty colorful, and it seemed to be the kind of film made for me. I mean, look at that pretty green. Neon green. My little brain wanted to see it. But it took a few years. I believe the first thing I saw of Re-Animator was after we moved to a new city, something we did a lot of, and got a new video store to go to. The store had movies played on televisions above the aisles, and had employees without much concern about who would be watching. So during one of those visits there with my father, who was too busy talking about something random with some stranger as usual, I got to watch a good long part of Re-Animator. I can't even remember if the sound was on. I only remember love at first sight. I was an impressionable kid with a love for the dark side. I was scared to death of Freddy Krueger, yet I watched all I could about him on television. For Herbert West, I didn't even know his name. I knew he was the guy with the glowing neon green syringe, looking intently at something on a poster that had mystified me for years. Having him above the screen at the registers at the video store was as close to seeing this movie as I would get for years. Although I hadn't seen the whole film, it certainly made an impression. As the years went on, and many horror movies later, I found myself sitting in a theater watching American Beauty. During a scene, two characters were talking about this very movie, which sent me back in time to the video store. Pretty soon after, I finally rented it and saw the whole thing for myself. And that story, man. That story got me to pay attention. So what's the story about here? A new student arrives on campus and becomes roommate with an A student who often has his girlfriend over, the dean's daughter. As the new student gets weirder, his secret experiments start to become a bit more problematic. That's the basis of the story here, but really it's much more than that. This was enough to hook most people, especially once you add the name of H.P. Lovecraft as the author of the original works that this film is based on. That name alone means a lot to many in the horror genre, and it's still a great source of base material for filmmakers. There is something in Lovecraft's writing that is easy to bring to modern audiences, either in a period piece or by modernizing it. Re-Animator, at its start of life as a film, was meant to be more faithful to the source material, which Lovecraft admitted he wrote for the money as he was paid per installment, something that happened a lot through the years with many authors. So writer-director Stuart Gordon and co-writer Dennis Powley took the original writings that became Re-Animator and turned it into something of their own, which they later admitted was closer to a Frankenstein parody than the original Re-Animator material. The film follows Herbert West, a mad genius medical student who has a nebulous background that starts in Germany, or so the poorly written German signs on the wall tell us. He finds his way to Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts. The names here are no accident, of course, and they have remained in the pop culture world for as long as they've been invented. Once at his new university, he meets Dan Kane, a good student with good grades, a good life, a good girlfriend, and all the good things one can expect to balance out Herbert West and his experiments. Or so we are made to think. As West left his previous school under odd circumstances, it's clear that he has some strange ideas about life and death, including how to circumvent the end or return from it. As any good horror movie would have it, he loves to experiment and soon uses his roommate's cat to try his serum on to see if it works. And well, it does, in a way. His horrific results quickly need to be tested on humans, and soon. And he finds the perfect subjects. Of course, this comes at a price, and Kane soon is involved much further than he'd like to be. Kane's beautiful girlfriend, Megan Halsey, is often at their home, eventually leading to the unthinkable. Of course, before we get to this, there's a talking head, some mayhem, and a lot of fake blood. Soon, Kane is faced with an impossible decision, and he goes for it, which leads to wrong results. It's bloody, it's creepy, it's goofy, it's all the teenager who grew up in the 80s could want. I had memories that now fit within a film, within a story. I also now had a better understanding of this film and had a massive love for it. Jeffrey Combs was adorable as the mad scientist, and Barbara Crampton was hot. Hell, she still is. Bruce Abbott was an all-American hero with a dark side. There was something for everyone here in terms of the cast. While Abbott has pretty much retired from acting, Combs and Crampton are still kicking ass and are always a pleasure when they appear on screen.
And that's, there's a real charm to it. And at the end, with the head of the villain being held over this poor naked Barbara Crampton, salivating, and who's going to listen to a talking head is brilliant.
As a teen, going in knowing just what I had seen in trailers and on those video store screens was enough to make me pick up the film. There was a lot of movies to choose from, but I remember Herbert West. I recalled the green glowing serum. I took this home and went into our creepy basement living room with no actual walls, a view of the washer and dryer, my closet, and the door to the outside stairs. Living in that neighborhood, strange noises were just part of life, and they added to any horror movie watching experience. So I set myself up to get the creeps from a movie and my environment. Of course, the main attraction here was the horror. The horror is balanced with humor, so the film doesn't become too serious or heavy. Of course, the sheer amount of fake blood used here, 24 gallons to be specific, takes the movie from just gory to a bit ridiculous in a significant way. The effects here are practical, meaning they've aged rather well, almost 40 years later. There's something about a bit of latex, some rubber, gallons of fake blood, a fake-looking dead cat, and a bunch of goo that make a film better than any CGI could ever do. Here the effects are lovely. They're gross. They're part of why I ended up wanting to work in special effects. Teenage me looked seriously into doing special effects for a living because of films like Re-Animator, Tremors, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and all those behind-the-scenes specials that were on TV as a kid. Alas, being allergic to many of the materials at the time, that ended up being the wrong career choice for this nerd. Nevertheless, horror films were a huge part of my childhood. Even if I wasn't allowed to watch them, I snuck as much of them in as I could. Like with Re-Animator, watching bits and pieces on the screens at that video store, watching movies while being babysat by a good but very allowing babysitter, reading about them in Fangoria, watching about them on Entertainment Tonight, and getting to watch a lot of them with my dad, as he didn't care one bit what I observed. Somewhere between being scared by Jason, traumatized by Freddy, I found Herbert West. One of those odd kinships. He was a weirdo, he was a maniac, but he was also misunderstood, and looking to understand life and death.
The really careful razor's edge dance that Stuart Gordon did in terms of keeping it not only moving forward, but having there be humor coming from the character of Dr. Herbert West. It's not making fun of him. He's very true to himself. But then that last act, unbelievable gore effects. It's sort of like Society, where you're building and it's like the frog in the kettle. You're building, and all of a sudden, boom, you get what you've been waiting for in ways you never imagined, and then you have to go like this. Wow, that was amazing.
I didn't know that some of this would be the making of my goth teenage period, the start of my love for horror and fake blood. Stuart Gordon would go on to adapt more of Lovecraft's work, such as From Beyond and Dagon, both cult classics in their own right. He even collaborated with writing partner Brian Yuzna to create a far less horrific tale with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Can you imagine parents saying to their kids, "What a fun and original story. Let's check out what else this Gordon fella can make." Nowadays, it seems younger audiences know of the film, but it is beloved by those who grew up with it. The sequels Bride of Re-Animator, released in 1990, and Beyond Re-Animator, released in 2003, are wacky and fun, but nothing comes close to the 1985 original.
Fright Night. If you love being scared, it'll be the night of your life. Rated R. Sneak preview Friday night. Check newspapers for theaters.
Tobe Hooper, I think, is my favorite Tobe Hooper film is absolutely Lifeforce. That movie just is 9 kinds of the best batshit crazy.
What to say about a movie that has nude vampires, screaming corpses, a zombie outbreak, Patrick Stewart speaking in a sexy lady's voice, and the end of the world as we know it? You're both dumbfounded and blown away when you're a kid watching a movie like this. It's possible you didn't even know that a film like this could be made. You've seen plenty of sci-fi movies before, and you've already watched the Star Wars trilogy a million times. Still, watching a large-scale sci-fi epic peppered with skeleton people, ghouls, and a hot, and I mean hot, naked lady is a different experience altogether. I may have never seen such wacky sci-fi horror material given such extensive budget treatment before. I'll admit, I don't even think I knew what was happening half the time, but you're damn sure I was enjoying every single solitary second of it. One thing that stood out to me back then, and still does now, is how straightforward the movie delivers its batshit crazy events to the audience. While it's over the top several times throughout, Lifeforce never winks at us or plays things tongue-in-cheek. The film's primarily British cast lends to an air of sophistication, acting very British-like to a series of bonkers events and horrific sights. Lifeforce has a fine line to walk regarding getting its tone right. As directed by horror master Tobe Hooper, Lifeforce commits to its crazy premise from the start, knowing that it has to present the dangers that the villains pose as legitimate, while still going full-bore horror when it's time to crank up the mayhem. When I was a kid, I had the unusual talent of remembering people's names in the credits of any movie I watched. Unlike many of my friends, and other kids my age, this meant that I was pumped when I saw specific names on movie posters or VHS box covers. I knew who Tobe Hooper was when I first saw Lifeforce, as I was already a big Poltergeist fan. Though I won't lie, that movie freaked me out a lot during my formative years. I knew he had made a film called Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but if I'm being brutally honest, I had not seen that one just yet. It was a little too daunting at such a young age. But knowing Hooper's name was attached to Lifeforce made me especially curious about it. And if that extra excellent opening title sequence doesn't already have you hooked, seeing his name at the end of the credits will do the job. And if that doesn't do the trick, how about when you meet the space vampires themselves? What a creepy and excellent set piece that is. And if we're being honest here, as a young man who still thought all girls had cooties, Matilda May's Space Girl certainly made an impression that can't be denied. And yes, she still does. I had seen nudity in movies before, but not quite like this. Putting this angelic beauty in the middle of such insanity was damn near life-altering for young me. Here's the exciting thing. I'm unsure if I recognized this as a vampire movie then. Yes, you realize the title Space Vampires at the beginning, but these aren't like other vampires that you've seen before. They're more like soul-sucking angels of death. And though they are indeed technically vampires, the movie is not your typical vampire film, which of course works in its favor. The movie is quite unclassifiable and unforgettable at the end of the day. It's a vampire movie unlike any other. And over 30 years later, it's still a blast and a half.
Fright Night is, again, that I saw it at Double Bill Drive-In with Return of the Living Dead. It was a great drive at Double Bill. And, you know, Fright Night is a real 80s movie. You know, it is an 80s vibe. You know, there's the sort of 80s dance club scene. There's an 80s sort of shoulder pads. That is an 80s movie. You want to, you know, see a time capsule of the 80s. Fright Night's a great way to see it.
A somewhat more familiar, though no less sinister, vampire can be found in 1985's other excellent vampire flick, Tom Holland's Fright Night.
Oh God, Fright Night is probably one of my favorite films. First off, who doesn't love Tom Holland? Just gonna throw that out there right now.
Fright Night I love because it's a horror comedy that really speaks to any lonely kid who wishes that all of this stuff were real. And just the what if of that movie, which is Hitchcockian obviously, but the what if of that movie, I think every single horror nerd has had that feeling or had that desire to have seen a monster. And I know it's there. And of course, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. It's just great, classic, simple storytelling using very familiar elements. Vampirism, adolescence, perversion.
In many ways, Jerry Dandridge is the quintessential vampire. He can blend in with the public, he's suave, he's got a manservant, he needs blood to live, and he's not a fan of crosses, mirrors, or sunlight. And here's the thing. He's a cool-ass dude the entire time. While we certainly relate more to the film's heroes, there's no doubt that Jerry seemed to be a pretty swinging guy at the time. Sure, he's up to no good, but if you're going to be killing off nubile teens, you might as well do it in style. Being a demented little kid, I thought, that's who I want to be when I grow up. Don't worry, I haven't drunk anyone's blood. Yet.
You think I'd come in, if I wasn't invited? You're absolutely right. But now that I've been invited, I'll just come over anytime, sort of thing. It's so wonderfully charming that, a vampire named Jerry.
But the main appeal Fright Night has going for it is its love of the genre. While not as self-referential as a movie like Scream, there's no doubt that Fright Night takes place in a world where the characters play by the rules of their genre, because they practically know they're in a horror movie. Look at Peter Vincent, the washed-up horror host played wonderfully by Roddy McDowall. As a kid, the concept of a horror host was a slightly vague one. I knew about Joe Bob Briggs, but he was, and still is, a different breed, as were Rhonda Shear and Gilbert Gottfried. And if you remember watching them on weekends, we can be friends. But Peter Vincent is an old-school host, hamming it up with props and atmosphere, introducing dreadfully cheesy movies that he used to star in. The fact that he gets in on the vampire action and becomes a believer and a real-life vampire killer just seemed like a wonderfully creative concept to younger me. Fright Night might have even made me want to become a horror host. And, well, here we are.
I liked it in the way that it was meta, in the way that you're dealing with a TV show host who is breaking the fourth wall, meaning a guy watching a TV show, which I, again, growing up, watched so much fucking TV, and I watched the Elvira shows where she's showing you movies. So it had that really cool kind of meta angle of this TV show host that dealt with vampires and a vampire movie next door. It had great practical effects in it. The transformations were amazing. It had great kills in it. And I just love the characters. It's characters that I wanted to follow and continue on with. I mean, obviously they did make a sequel to it. But it was fun. I mean, when you asked me, like, what's the quintessential 80s movie for me, I would say Fright Night. Fright Night to me is a movie that I've probably seen 1,000 times in my life. It is, it's just one of those movies that I have huge nostalgia around that title. The VHS box, renting it for the first time, Chris Sarandon. I mean, everything about that movie just clicked. It was fun. It was scary. It had great set pieces in it. It's a good one.
Notably, the film had characters who I could relate to. Charlie Brewster, our lead, is not a cool dude, but a horror movie loving dork who's awkward with his girlfriend and has an annoying, entertaining best friend. Making the protagonist a bit of a doofus is an inspired choice, as is making him such a horror nerd that when he starts making bold accusations about his new neighbor,
He's a vampire.
people just think he's crying wolf.
A what?
Or worse, going nuts. The fact that the movie was doing a sort of 80s riff on Rear Window was lost on me when I was younger, but that didn't matter. The premise is so cool on its own. What if a dorky lover of horror movies found himself living next to a real-life vampire? Worse than that, he was the only one seeing those vampiric activities. Like the poor sap in the Twilight Zone segment, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. It just seems like dreadful luck that he's the only one privy to the horrors going on outside. Everyone else thinks Jerry is a pretty neat guy, adding insult to injury. But what a wonderful moment it is when Peter Vincent, the most prominent skeptic of them all, sees something disturbing. Jerry doesn't cast a reflection. Roddy McDowall's performance is so good right then because you can see his mind is blown in one instant, and everything he'd believed his entire life changes. It's a great sequence that sets up a killer second half. Seeing a movie shift gears halfway through as a kid was always wild. Now, it's not so startling when a movie decides that it wants to be a different kind of flick at the midway point, but back in the 80s, it was much less common. Fright Night plays mainly as a comedy during its first half, with the horror bits lurking at the edges as we become engrossed in Charlie's humorous dilemma. But once Peter Vincent is sold and Evil Ed is turned, the movie stops playing around and becomes a full-bore horror affair, and holy hell is it awesome. Visual effects legend Richard Edlund, who before this worked on the Star Wars trilogy, Poltergeist, and even Ghostbusters, unleashes some brutal effects in the film's rip-roaring third act. While the effects are plentiful and impressive, they don't overwhelm the story. And yes, Richard Edlund was one of those names I always remembered. Hell, the dude's name was on half the movies I watched back then. The standout scene here is the genuinely grotesque and sad death of Evil Ed, a character we enjoyed in the first half, even though he is usually a pain in the ass. But we all had a friend like Ed. Hell, maybe even you were the Ed of your friend group. And it's a damn shame what happens to the poor kid at the end of Fright Night. If we're talking scenes that freaked me out as a child, that one is way up there, alongside the pool of skeletons in Poltergeist and the werewolf transformation in An American Werewolf in London. As was the case in An American Werewolf, it just looks so painful to be going through what Ed's going through. And the scene seems to play out over too long of a time, and Peter's tragic reaction to it all is very relatable. We want the poor guy to rest in peace already.
It's so interesting, like when I look through, the movies that I'm gravitating towards are horror comedies or horror that have comedy in them. Because I would argue, you can't have a comedy and sort of put a little horror in. That kind of upsets the mix. The recipe doesn't work. But if you have a horror movie that really does deliver on the horror elements, but then have the comedy come not from making fun of horror, but having characters that are funny, that can make commentary on the horrific situations, that's where the real, or irony, you know, situations that have ironic elements that are fuel from the horror tropes, then it works.
All those elements are why Fright Night was a big one for me, and still is. It's a must during the Halloween season, one of the great party flicks from the 80s, and one of the greatest vampire movies of all time. Combined with Lifeforce, you have a double feature that can't be beaten, seriously. Two of 1985's standout horror films prove you can take very different approaches to the concept of vampirism and make them work. I know just watching either of them brings me back to those late nights when I was huddled before the TV at my childhood home, having my butt kicked by movies with a flair for the dramatic. These movies are the things 80s horror memories are made of.
J. Romero's Day of the Dead.
Due to scenes of violence, no one under 17 admitted.
Starts Friday at a theater or drive-in near you. Check newspapers for showtimes.
You know, the Dawn of the Dead trailer, I'll never forget, because the film was unrated, so they wouldn't play the trailer before 11 o'clock at night because it was almost considered pornographic. So if you wanted to see the trailer for Dawn of the Dead, you'd have to wait till 11 o'clock at night and hope that they would play the trailer. Now, being in Pittsburgh, I was fine with it because it was shot there, so they played a lot of trailers.
When my dad showed me this film, I was already obsessed with the genre, but this one in particular only elevated it. So much so that I was taken to Monroeville, Pennsylvania to walk around the actual mall. Unfortunately though, there was no cheeseball elevator music to act as my soundtrack. No, this was the 90s, so it was most likely something even more cheesy, like Creed. No offense, Scott Stapp fans out there. I know there's one of you. Where Night showed us the disordered times of the 60s, Dawn showed us how selfish and self-absorbed we as a society can be with consumerism. However, as the helicopter sets off away from the mall at the end, it gives the feeling of an uncertainty towards a hopeful future. Then we find out what the future is with the capper of his Dead trilogy. And my friends, it is looking grim. I have to admit, it took me a little longer to finally get around to watching this one. As with taste buds, my hunger for the living dead started to taste a little stale. But in the early 2000s, a brand new band came onto the scene with their debut album, Gorillaz. One track on that album, M1A1, stood out amongst the rest of the songs for its intense yet killer sampling from a film that I wasn't familiar with. Forget the rest of the song. Those minute and 40 seconds of pulsating bass lines with a man crying out, as if he were on an episode of Seinfeld, were played repeatedly. When I look in the liner notes, I found exactly where that sample came from, and I absolutely had to watch this film.
Day of the Dead is, I think of the first three Romero zombie movies, this is actually my favorite. I think I love the John Harrison score. I love just the sort of doomed vibe of it, you know, the scene, I think it was Terry Alexander, just says, "You're never gonna figure it out. You're never gonna know." And there's something, there's that resignation to, you know, you're trying to solve a mystery that nobody cares about and there's nobody to care.
Day of the Dead was more than just a continuation of Romero's Dead series. It was a visceral exploration of a world teetering on the edge of oblivion. Gone was the hope for a cure and a return to somewhat normalcy. Right from the jump, after a very effective nightmare sequence, we see a city in shambles with the only remaining humans crying out for the living. The dead, and a random alligator, have taken over and the human race is on the brink of extinction. With most of the film taking place in an underground bunker, it eliminates all the fun sequences that we had in the previous entry. Instead, it gives us a feeling of panic, hopelessness, and claustrophobia. There are no fun trips to the stores and no sliding down escalators or lighthearted camaraderie. No, this group of survivors is in their last-ditch effort to stay alive, while trying to find ways to cure this zombie outbreak, all the while turning on each other and not caring of just about anything. That's not to say that none of the characters are fun though. Yes, they are truly terrible people, but hot damn they are fun to watch. Take the main villain of the movie, Captain Rhodes. This recently appointed leader of the group, you know, after the death of their last one, is the biggest tool bag of all time. A grade A asshole with a massive power trip.
I'm running this monkey farm now, Frankenstein, and I want to know what the fuck you're doing with my time!
Ready to kill anyone who crosses the line.
You better know I mean it too, people.
But oh god, why is he so damn enjoyable? Certainly not his character purse, but the way actor Joseph Pilato portrayed him. I mean, the way he hams it up in every scene he's in, he absolutely owns it. Even though we know how it will end for the bad guys in the 80s, there was joy in watching movies like this where a villain is so despicable that you just know he's going to pay big time.
You are gonna pay. Ooh, are you gonna pay?
I know I'm starting to sound like my old man, but they just don't make villains like they used to. This brings me to the film's hero, Sarah Bowman, played by Laurie Cardille. The scientist desperately seeking a cure who embodies resilience and a quest for hope amidst the darkness to Rhodes' unraveling of authority. In any other major studio release, this type of role would go to someone like Kurt Russell, a total take charge and no questions asked badass. Also a male. This type of character is seen in almost every 80s action movie, yet she's severely underappreciated. Hell, in an alternate universe, I could even see this character and Jack Burton teaming up against some other supernatural threat. Your move, Carpenter.
And a man would have to be some kind of fool to think we're all alone in this universe.
Now, enough about these humans. How about the stars of the show? The two previous films indeed had a smaller budget, and while the zombies looked all fine and dandy in their blue and green makeup, their look in Day of the Dead appeared decayed and gruesome, the way we think about how modern zombies should look. This is all thanks to the works of Tom Savini and his pal Greg Nicotero, and a larger budget of course. The true standout performance is that of Bub. a test subject from scientist Dr. Logan.
I think, probably told the story before, but my son, Devin, since he was born, I have called him Bub. And it has always been after Bub the zombie from Day of the Dead. And I remember showing that movie to him when he was, in his, 12, 13, 14, something like that. And telling him that this is why I call you Bub. I still call him Bub to this day. And him loving it, him loving the whole zombie genre and embracing that zombie madness.
Logan believes through training and conditioning, the zombies can be domesticated. Eventually, we see the human emotions come from Bub, brought out through a powerful performance by Howard Sherman. The moment he raises a gun to shoot Rhodes remains one of my favorite images in all of horror. And the pain he feels when he sees Dr. Frankenstein dead, that's just great stuff, man. Romero continued his Dead legacy in the aughts, and they were fine for the most part. But dude, that original trilogy is truly something special. Day of the Dead may be considered one of the weaker entries of the three, but for me, it doesn't get any better.
That has a great sort of end of that cycle, and the ending of them on the beach. With the helicopter there's something so hopeful about it for a franchise that it usually ends with nothing but doom.
Now let's change that dial to see what's happening on the other side of the coin.
The Return of the Living Dead.
Return of the Living Dead. Send more cops. Who doesn't love that, right?
When I said my pops introduced me to zombies, one was certainly not in that conversation. This was one of those having to stay up late at night while the parents were asleep flicks. But I'm a night owl. Always have been for as long as I can remember. So staying up late watching a little premium cable was pretty much the norm on the weekends. Before I was able to rent whatever the hell I wanted, HBO and Cinemax were responsible for warping my fragile little mind by introducing me to blood, boobs, and foul language. I mean, do any of you kiddos out there remember staying up late to watch the premiere of Pamela Anderson's Naked Souls? Don't lie. However, on the horror side of things, one movie in particular stood out: The Return of the Living Dead, the partiest of all zombie movies.
Return of the Living Dead was another one that I got on video because I was in high school and it was a pretty busy time, but I could always go to the video store and walk out with a big old stack of movies. The thing I loved about Return of the Living Dead is it was so fucking weird. It was just so out there and just more brains. It took all of the zombie movie tropes that Romero had been sort of swimming in since 1968, was it? I think it was 68, yeah, since 68, and turned them on their head.
Unlike the somber seriousness of Day of the Dead, writer-director Dan O'Bannon went for a full-on punk rock attitude. The undead weren't just mindless eaters, they were cracking jokes, and their soundtrack was straight from the punk scene. I'm talking The Damned, TSOL, The Cramps, The Flesh Eaters. For the young skater in me, this was all I could ever want in a horror flick. It was rebellious, in your face, and a middle finger to the conventional norms of the genre.
One of the best things about Return of the Living Dead is its sheer audacity. It is, I love that the beginning, sets out that this story is true. And right then you know tonally the movie that you're seeing.
And understandably, when I was a youngster, seeing the title The Return of the Living Dead had me believe that I would be watching the sequel to the Romero original, and in color no less. As it turns out, there is a big what-if factor that comes into play here. After releasing Night of the Living Dead, Romero and co-scribe John Russo parted ways, agreeing that Russo could continue using Living Dead in future titles. This led to Russo eventually releasing the sequel novel, The Return of the Living Dead. A film adaptation was eventually given a go, even with Tobe Hooper at the helm, but it failed to materialize, and Hooper went on to make the very bonkers Lifeforce. At the same time, Dark Star and Alien screenwriter Dan O'Bannon was brought in to give the script a complete overhaul, removing anything tied directly to Romero's work. Well, except that it implies the black and white classic not only exists, but is also based on actual events.
Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
As an almost act of rebellion, it took the rules established in that film and threw them away in the trash. These weren't your grandpa's undead. They were fast, spoke, and were pretty much unkillable, which makes the Return of the Living Dead a wild and unpredictable watch. As far as the humans go, the group of punks in this film come off as cliched caricatures, but I wanted to be hanging out with them. I'd take Spider, Trash, Casey, Chuck, Scuzz, and Suicide's side over any group in Shermer, Illinois any day of the week. Those are my people. Hell, I was in that group in high school, riding in cars while blasting metal and punk and occasionally frequenting a local cemetery or two.
Do you ever fantasize about being killed?
Unfortunately, no one in my group of friends did a random striptease on top of a tombstone, and they definitely didn't look like Linnea Quigley. And speaking of trash, if I had anything to blame on watching these types of films at a young age, it would be how I'm about 95% sure that Linnea Quigley set me on the fast track to early puberty. Thank you. For the non-punks, we have Clu Gulager as Bert, Weekend at Bernie's Don Calfa as his pal Ernie, and Poltergeist James Karen as Frank. Even if these folks may have questioned why they decided to jump aboard a film as wild as this, it's pretty awesome to see these veteran actors take a chance to hang out in our playground.
And it's, Clue's performance in that film is so much fun. Don Calfa, all those guys, it is James Karen, it is tonally such a good time. Yet tragic, and again, but it is a great era to Night of the Living Dead, and it knows how to have a good time. It knows how to be fun.
They all bring their A game here to make their characters work with believability.
And the makeup effects were great. It was also very fun. There's a lot of yelling in that movie. I've watched it recently. People yell a lot in that movie, a lot of screaming. But it screams of joy from the audience watching it because it is just so unbelievably out there. Another movie that really effectively blended horror and comedy, but more than anything, expertly directed. It really is very precisely directed. There's no waste. It's all economical. And they took that finite location and really capitalized on all the suspense and tension and horror that you could generate from one location.
Both Day of the Dead and The Return of the Living Dead will always stand the test of time. As with Romero's Dead saga, The Return of the Living Dead also spawned several sequels that never hit the same magic as the first. However, I will always defend the madness of Return of the Living Dead 3. While both are different, their impact can be seen in the modern era. Take a look at The Walking Dead, for example. Who knows if we would even have that show and its 100 spin-offs if it weren't for films like Day of the Dead focusing more on the human race? Or would we still have the zaniness of Shaun of the Dead or Cooties without O'Bannon's splatter piece? One thing these films have in common is the thought of inevitability. No matter what these characters do, the dead keep coming, and there's nothing they can do about it. So, which side of the zombie apocalypse would you want to be on? The one where people try to take over and claim superiority over one another, crushing all hopes of the last surviving strand of humanity that we have left? Or would you rather crank down your window and blast some high-octane tunes while holding your middle finger in the air as you laugh at the chaos that we made?